to On the Other Hand. The topic of free trade is a perennial source of controversy. Negotiations to remove trade barriers are often met with violent protests. Meanwhile, industries regularly ask for protection from imports, claiming that foreign competition would ruin them if local consumers would choose foreign goods. In this discussion, we look at the economics of trade barriers, with an emphasis on tariffs. With me is David Seymour from the Frontier Center for Public Policy.
Hello.
To start with the basic concept, what are tariffs and trade barriers?
Well, trade barriers generally are regulations that make it harder for consumers to purchase goods and services from other countries. And tariffs are a particular type of trade barrier. They're a tax that must be paid on an imported good, but not on an equivalent locally made good.
And what is the argument for them?
Well, suppose a table manufacturer in Canada makes tables for $150, but a foreign manufacturer can make identical ones for $100. Now, apart from extremely patriotic consumers, no one's going to buy a Canadian-made table for $150. Typically, the local table industry will then come along and say, well, we can't compete. There needs to be a $50 tariff on foreign tables so that people will buy our tables too.
So tariffs allow local industries to survive. That seems hard to be against.
Well, it is if you focus only on the tariff's immediate effects for some groups. In this example, the table industry and everyone associated with it are certainly helped. But the situation changes dramatically when you consider the effects on other groups, starting with the consumer.
Okay, that's not hard to see. They're now paying $50 more than previously, so in effect, there's a subsidy for consumers to producers.
Well, that's true, but there are other secondary effects as well. The $50 that the consumer pays in tariffs can no longer be spent on other goods, so it's not just that the consumer gets a worse deal on the table. He or she is also less able to support other businesses in the local economy.
But the $50 doesn't just disappear. It becomes government revenue. That means governments can either reduce other taxes or spend more.
Well, yes, that's certainly true, but it only applies if people actually buy the imported tables. Now, if they do that anyway, then the purpose of helping the local industry is defeated.
But if the consumer would have bought from overseas anyways, surely it's better to produce tables locally and less efficiently than to send money overseas.
Well, the thing about importing is that exports and imports have to eventually balance. And that's why it's so crazy to have the mentality that exports are somehow good and imports are always bad.
Why should exports and imports balance?
Well, it comes back to the currency. If a Canadian buys a product from the United States, he or she has to exchange Canadian dollars for US dollars to purchase in the States. So now that leaves some American holding Canadian dollars, and there's only one place Canadian dollars are actually useful, and that's here in Canada. So eventually they have to bring those dollars back to Canada and use them to buy Canadian goods. For that reason, no country can export without importing. In fact, importing increases the potential for exporting and vice versa.
Even if we accept that tariffs simply shelter inefficient producers at the expense of consumers and exporters, where's the evidence that local producers offer lower quality or more expensive goods in the first place?
Well, first of all, if the producers were more competitive, they wouldn't be requiring tariff protection in the first place. The fact that they do suggests consumers would prefer to trade more if it weren't for the tariffs. But second, all countries have advantages and disadvantages, so it's not a case of all producers in Canada producing low-quality goods. Canada has many competitive advantages, but producers are kneecapped as exporters by the restrictions on imports. A final piece of evidence is the world's diversity. The Caribbean has a better climate for growing fruit than Canada does, but Saskatchewan has a massive supply of potash, so it's better at supplying fertilizer than most other places. Silicon Valley in California has a concentrated population of engineers who can collaborate and produce complex technology. Then in Southeast Asia, many low-skilled workers are prepared to do work that most Canadians would consider menial. But the point is that by preventing consumers from accessing the best producers of each product, everybody ends up poorer.
Nevertheless, suddenly removing tariffs could devastate whole industries.
Well, it certainly could, but as soon as tariffs are introduced, the question is always how to get out of them. They're just one of those policies. The real question is why introduce them in the first place. Of course, they can be phased out gradually to minimize the shock if that's a great concern.
Despite the logic of removing tariffs, they remain a policy reality. You have cotton in the United States, dairy products in Canada, most agricultural products in the European Union, and so on. If the case for removing tariffs is so clear-cut economically, why are more countries not involved in it?
Well, first of all, some countries have. For example, New Zealand has unilaterally removed almost all tariffs. But for the most part, it's a question of political dynamics. The protected industries are visible and existent, whereas the exporters that might come into existence if tariffs were removed actually take an effort to imagine. So the beneficiaries of tariffs have a lot more to lose than consumers have to gain. Going back to our table example, if the average person buys a new table every 10 years, then they lose $50 or $5 per year due to tariffs. Now that's annoying, perhaps, but nobody is going to take political action for a $5 per year benefit. On the other hand, if you're a table manufacturer that sells 1,000 tables per year, that's $150,000 that you wouldn't get if there were no tariffs. So the incentives for political lobbying are always balanced in favor of tariffs, even if it's a bad policy.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
So to summarize, tariffs that protect local industries do so at the expense of consumers and exporters. Consumers are cut off from accessing the most efficient producers in the world for each product, so they end up with less wealth. Because imports and exports must ultimately balance, reducing imports also reduces the potential for exports. In our next episode, we look at the policy of saving the X industry. Is bailing out dying industries an investment or a waste? Until then, I'm Jamie Stevenson, and this has been On the Other Hand.